Well, I think I have an awful lot to offer. And if you look at my background, I'll give you my resume a little bit later, but when you look at my background, you'll see that I've got expertise in 3 areas. One is in jobs, because I was a professional recruiter for 35 years. The other is in economics, because that's my favorite subject. And the third is in information technology, because I worked in the IT realm for actually 42 years of my life. You bring those 3 areas of expertise together, and it allows me to be able to create the kind of public policy that will help bring prosperity and lower the cost of living for people. And that's my number one objective, is to lower the cost of living and increase prosperity in this riding.
What do you think qualifies you for this position?
Well, like I said, a lot of it has to do with my background. And I know how, this is my 7th time running as a politician. And every time I run, I learn a little bit more. And what I understand now is I understand how the political system works far better than I did 8 years ago when I first ran. So I understand the role of an MP better than I think most MPs are trying to do this for the first time. I know what you can and cannot do, and I will work within the limitations of that role, but I'll also use the assets of my background to be able to bring about the synergies that you can bring about within the community itself without necessarily always depending upon government to help out.
The main issues for this riding as you see them?
Well, I hear it all the time, it's affordability. It's always affordability. It's not just me talking about it, it's the Conservatives too. Jamie, if you've talked to Jamie, he'll talk about affordability as well, because it is the number one issue. There are people who talk about climate change, there are people who talk about immigration, but ultimately the thing that affects every single citizen in this riding, and really everybody in this country, is the cost of living, which is rising constantly. And my view of it is that the cost of living is rising primarily because of the government itself. Because as taxation has risen, and it's risen 40% over the last 60 years, we are paying more of our hard income, we're paying that to the tax authorities, and we're not keeping as much of it. So when you've got 53% of your income going to taxation, you're only keeping 47 cents in the dollar, and that's not going very far anymore. And most people talk about that because it affects housing, it affects pharmacare or pharmacy costs, it affects energy costs, it affects everything in our life, and it's all because the government's taking too much.
So what would you do about these things?
Well, I mean, it's my economic background that really inspires my interest in trying to reduce the cost of living. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it, but my fundamental understanding of the way government works is that every time you pass a new piece of legislation in Parliament, what you do is you give the government a new set of responsibilities to have to enforce. Once that legislation is passed, the politicians have pretty much done their job, and they pass it over to the bureaucracy to enforce it. And what they do is, of course, the people in the bureaucracy have to figure out how are we going to be able to enforce it? What do we need in the way of resources? So they look at the people they need, they look at the computer systems they need, they look at the office space, they look at whatever capital budgets and capital expenditures that they're going to have to put out. And so it really breaks down into 2 areas. One is what is the implementation cost to get the new program up and running in the first place. So that's one cost. And then after that, what is the ongoing operating costs year after year after year? And we all know, of course, once a department head gets a budget and enforces a program, every year he wants to jack it up by 5%. So you know constantly it's going to expand. And all that ever does in the end is it either ends up in higher taxes or it ends up in higher public debt. And right now our public debt is almost $700 billion. If you haven't looked it up, please do. And the provincial government's debt is $750 billion. And if you put those two together, that's $1 trillion. And if you break it down per person in Ontario, it's $43,100 that you owe to government debt. Anyone in your family does, everybody in this riding does, every single person in Ontario owes that to the different levels of government, and I'm fighting that.
Where do you stand on the issue of guns?
You know, I respect the rights of responsible gun owners, the ones that abide the law. I know that the implementation of the gun trying to remember the name of it right now, but the certification system we have today has really gone off the rails for a lot of gun owners, and I think that's a mistake. So we need to respect law-abiding gun owners. At the same time, we need to focus on going after criminals who misuse firearms. And that's really where the focus should be. And I know that the People's Party and Maxime Bernier wants to revise the Firearms Act that we have today because I don't think it's working anymore, and come in with a common sense system that protects the gun owner who's responsible and goes after the criminal who's not using it properly.
Where do you stand on abortion?
I don't take a side on abortion, and the main reason for it is because, well, two reasons really. The abortion topic keeps coming up over and over and over again, and it's never resolved. And it's never resolved because you've got 37 million people in Canada. They all have a different opinion. You're never going to get 100% of Canadians agreeing on one or the other side of the argument. So for me, it really comes down to the individual decision that people make, and I will support that. But other than that, I don't see any reason for the government to get involved in legislation regarding abortion.
Climate change. Where do you stand on climate change?
We take a very different stance on climate change. We are a very pragmatic party. And so if you look at using things like legislation, regulations, and taxation, those are very, very blunt instruments to affect any changes in the climate at all. In fact, they're useless instruments really when you start to look at what the history of taxation and the results that have come about as a result of changing our climate. We've seen no evidence that taxation does anything. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to instead make investments in areas where we can use the talent of our engineers and our scientists and our other delivery professionals to bring real solutions to real problems that you can measure and tackle, and get the government out of it, because their blunt instruments just are not useful at all. They don't work.
What about pipelines?
Pipelines will bring about prosperity in Canada, increased prosperity in Canada. We are not going to get rid of the petroleum industry, the fossil fuels industry tomorrow. That's not going to happen. It'll be around for a while, and as long as it's around, we need to be able to serve our own petroleum needs, our own fossil fuel needs. We have to do it, whether we like it or not. A lot of people won't be happy about that, but that's reality. We see solar energy and wind energy as not being reliable, which is the reason why we have to have backup systems that are highly costly just to support a technology that's not reliable. And that's a duplication of costs, and that's one of the reasons why our energy costs have gone so high. So over time, I know that we will transition to a different type of energy economy than we are today, because fossil fuels will not sustain us forever. But in the meantime, we have to continue to support it. So I support the creation of any kind of energy system that will make us more prosperous and more independent in the use of energy, and more cost effectively.
We need jobs in this riding. What would you do to bring jobs?
That's my sweet spot. You hit it right on the head, okay? The sweet spot is this. Like I said, I've been a recruiter for 35 years. I've interviewed well over 10,000 people for jobs. I've serviced, I don't know how many thousands of companies with job requests, hiring managers. So I have firsthand front row experience dealing with the job marketplace. With my economics expertise, and I have a lot of it, I've been studying economics for a long time, I would be looking at how can I leverage the assets of the Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock riding to ensure that we can attract investment here, to ensure that we can encourage our existing business owners, small and large, to be able to expand their operations. And one of the ways you do it is you get the government out of the way, because if they overtax and overregulate, you don't create a very inviting environment for investment and job growth. So I'd be focusing on those two things primarily.
What do you do for fun?
Well, I'm a Nordic cross skater. So I go out and exercise 3 times a week on Nordic cross skates. I play hockey with a bunch of the guys locally here in the wintertime, and I have a great time with those guys. We play old timers, so we go out and have a good time. Then we have a beer afterwards and tell lies to each other. Of course, that's what the old guys do when they play hockey, but the great days.